The woman in the back row had done nothing but sit down and open a notebook, and the professor had stopped his own lecture to order her out in front of 200 students. "Ma'am, this is a graduate seminar. I think you've wandered into the wrong room. You'll need to leave." She'd slipped in a few minutes earlier, a black woman in a gray cardigan with a notebook, taking a back seat to watch the class without disturbing it. To Professor Alan Reeder, 30 years behind that lectern, an unfamiliar face in his hall could only mean one thing: someone who didn't belong. So he set down his chalk and, in the patient voice of a man used to being obeyed, told her to go. He was certain she was wrong for the room. He was about to learn how wrong he was, because the woman he was ordering into the hallway hadn't wandered into the wrong class. She was the new dean of the faculty, appointed the week before, there to observe his teaching, her name already in every professor's inbox, and her signature would soon decide the future of his department. Before we find out who the woman they ordered out of the room really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. Her name was Dr. Camille Foster, and she was 49 years old, and 1 week earlier, she'd become the dean of the entire faculty that Professor Alan Reeder had taught in for 3 decades. The appointment had not felt to Camille like a triumph so much as a door she had spent 30 years walking toward finally standing open. There had been a reception, of course, the provost, the trustees, the good wine, the speeches about a historic hire, the phrase first black woman said warmly by people who meant well and did not quite hear how it located her. She had smiled through it, and at the end of the evening, she had slipped out onto a stone terrace for a moment alone. And she had thought about her father, dead some years now, who had pushed a dust mop down these very corridors at night and told a small girl in the empty lecture halls that the rooms were hers. She had wished, with a sharpness that surprised her, that he could have seen the plaque with her name and her title on the door of the dean's office. The office, as it happened, at the end of a hall he used to clean. She had gone back inside and thanked everyone graciously. And then she had gone quietly to work, because a title on a door changes nothing about the habits inside the building, and she of all people knew it. Camille had spent her whole life in classrooms, and she had spent a good part of it being told, in 100 spoken and unspoken ways, that the room she wanted to enter had not been built with her in mind. She was the daughter of a school custodian, a man who had cleaned a university's halls at night, pushing a wide dust mop down corridors lined with the portraits of men who did not look like him, and who had told his daughter, again and again, that there was no room in that building. She was not as entitled to stand in as anyone whose face was on the wall. He used to take her with him on the occasional weekend shift when she was small, and let her sit in the great empty lecture halls while he worked, and he would sweep the aisles and say, without stopping, that these were just rooms, that the men in the portraits had put their trousers on one leg at a time, same as anybody, and that the only thing standing between his daughter and any seat in the house was other people's failure of imagination, which was their problem to fix and not hers to accept. She had sat in those empty halls as a girl, in the hush after hours, and let herself believe she belonged in every one of them. It was the single most valuable thing anyone ever gave her, and it had cost her father nothing but the willingness to say it to a child the world had not yet gotten around to discouraging. Decades later, walking into lecture halls as the dean who oversaw them all, she still thought of him pushing a wide dust mop down a corridor of portraits, telling her the rooms were hers. She had believed him the way you believe a parent, which is to say completely and then painfully, conditionally, as the world spent years testing the claim. She had tested it herself, every step of the way. She had been the only black woman in her doctoral cohort, and had learned to carry the particular exhaustion of being the only one, the assumption, every September, that she was lost, or an administrator, or someone's assistant, before anyone assumed she was the scholar with her name on the syllabus. She had published work that reshaped her field while sitting on committees where her ideas landed in silence and were praised 10 minutes later in a male colleague's mouth. There was one department meeting she never quite forgot, early in her career, where she had proposed a restructuring of the graduate curriculum, laid it out carefully with data, and watched it die in the particular silence reserved for ideas the room has decided not to hear from the person offering them. 10 minutes later, a senior man had said essentially the same thing, in slightly grander words, and the table had nodded as though a light had been switched on. She had gone home that night and written the whole proposal up as a paper instead, under her own name, where no one could launder it. And that paper had gone on to change how 3 universities trained their graduate students. She had learned from 100 versions of that meeting not to waste her anger on the room, but to convert it into something the room could not take credit for. It was the same discipline she brought decades later to a lectern where a man was ordering her out of a chair. She had learned, across 25 years, a specific kind of composure, not the absence of anger, but the disciplined conversion of it, the stillness of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that the underestimating no longer surprises her, only informs her. And she had taken the deanship, after a long and distinguished career, because she had come to believe one thing above all others, that a faculty is shaped far less by its policies than by its habits, the small, daily, unwritten ways it decides who belongs in the room and who is asked, politely, to leave it. You cannot read those habits from behind a desk. You cannot find them in a report. So she had decided, in her very first weeks, to do a thing her predecessors never had. She would visit classrooms, unannounced. She would sit in the back, in ordinary clothes, and simply watch how the faculty taught and how the students were treated when no one important seemed to be looking. That was the entire reason she was sitting in the back row of Alan Reeder's lecture hall that morning, in a gray cardigan with a notebook, as unremarkable as she could make herself. She had not come to catch him. She had come to watch a class. She was about to become the lesson instead. She had started the classroom visits her second day in the job, and by that morning, she had sat quietly in the back of nearly a dozen of them. Most had moved her. She had watched a young lecturer in the sciences turn a room of half-asleep undergraduates electric with nothing but genuine delight in her subject. She had watched an old historian, near retirement, learn every one of his 100 students' names and use them. She had slipped into those rooms unrecognized, a middle-aged woman with a notebook, easily mistaken for a returning student or an auditor or someone's visiting aunt. And she had watched teaching happen the way it happens when no dean is thought to be present. And she had come away more often than not, quietly reassured about the faculty she'd been hired to lead. That was the point. She was not hunting for villains. She was trying to learn the truth of the place, and the truth of a place is only ever what it does when it believes no one important is watching. What made this particular morning different from all the ones before? It was not yet visible to anyone in that hall, and it is worth laying out plainly because it turns everything that followed from a rudeness into something with real weight behind it. Camille Foster's appointment had been announced 8 days earlier, in a message sent to every professor in the school, Alan Reeder included. It had sat in his inbox, unread, beneath the pile of things men like Reeder never quite got around to reading. Her photograph had been on the faculty's own website since, on the page headed Office of the Dean, which anyone in that lecture hall could have pulled up on the phones in their pockets. And this is the part that would keep Reeder awake for a long time afterward. The department's upcoming program review, the one that would shape its budget, its hires, and the standing of its senior faculty for years to come, would land for final sign-off on exactly one desk in the entire university. Hers. So, when she walked into his hall that morning and took a seat in the back, the most powerful administrator on the campus was sitting in Alan Reeder's classroom in a gray cardigan, watching him teach. And Alan Reeder was about to look at her, decide she was no one, and order her out in front of 200 witnesses. The man at the podium was Alan Reeder, 61, and he had taught in that department for 30 years, and he had come, somewhere along the way, to believe that the room belonged to him. Reeder was, by reputation, brilliant and difficult, a scholar with genuine accomplishments and a lectern manner that treated teaching as a performance and the students as a fortunate audience admitted to it. He had a fixed picture in his mind of what his graduate seminar looked like, who filled its seats, who belonged in the serious rooms of a serious discipline, who had earned the right to be there. And when he glanced up from his notes and saw, in the back row, a face he did not recognize, a black woman, no visible student lanyard, sitting quietly with a notebook, the picture in his head did not stretch to accommodate her. It flagged her. Not a colleague, not a visiting scholar, certainly not, in the geometry of Alan Reeder's imagination, anyone who might outrank him. Someone who had wandered in where she did not belong and needed to be corrected. He would have been genuinely offended to be told what he was doing. He did not think of it as prejudice. He thought of it as standards, as a professor's prerogative to keep order in his own classroom. But the instinct that decided, in half a second, and on no evidence whatsoever, that the unfamiliar black woman must be an intruder, was not standards. It was the oldest assumption there is, wearing an academic gown, and Reeder had been indulging it in smaller and more deniable ways for years. There had been a first-generation student 2 years earlier, a brilliant young man, the first in his family to reach a university, whom Reeder had asked on the first day of the seminar, in front of everyone, whether he was quite sure he was in the right course. A small thing, said with a smile, but the young man had heard exactly what was underneath it, the way you always hear it, and by spring he had transferred out of the concentration, and Reeder had never thought about him again. His name was Marcus, no relation to anyone in this story, just one of the thousands of young men that first name belongs to, and he had come to that university carrying his entire family's hopes in a way only the first one ever does. He had chosen the concentration because of a book Reeder had written, had read it twice in high school, in a library because he couldn't afford his own copy, had walked into that seminar the first day nearly sick with the specific terror of a kid who has been told his whole life that he is smart and has never yet been in a room that agreed. And Reeder had looked at him and asked him, pleasantly in front of everyone, whether he was quite sure he was in the right course. 6 words. The young man had laughed it off because you have to. Then he'd sat through a semester of his raised hand going unseen, and he'd told his advisor when he switched concentrations that it just hadn't been the right fit, because at 19 you do not yet have the words for what it actually was, and because naming it out loud would have meant admitting how much it had cost him. He graduated eventually in something safer. He never took another literature course. Reeder could not have picked him out of a crowd. That is the thing about the damage. The man who does it walks away without a scratch or a memory, and the person it lands on carries it for years, quietly, as a private verdict about where they are allowed to want things. That was the mechanism of it. The damage men like Reeder did was always invisible to them because it took the shape of people quietly leaving, and you do not notice the students who are no longer there to raise their hands. So he set down his chalk, and he addressed the woman in the back row from his podium in front of 200 students in the patient, condescending voice of a man completely certain that he was simply keeping order in a room that was his. Ma'am, yes, you, in the back. 200 heads turned. This is a graduate seminar, by enrollment only. I believe you're in the wrong room. You'll need to gather your things and step out. Camille looked up from her notebook, unhurried, and answered him in a voice pitched only to carry as far as it needed to. I'm not enrolled, she said. I'm here to observe, with permission. Please, go on with your lecture. I don't want to interrupt it. Observe. Reeder repeated the word as though it were faintly absurd, and let a small ripple of obedient laughter move through the front rows. This is not a public gallery. People do not simply wander in to observe my seminar. If you have some authorization, some paperwork, I would be delighted to see it. Otherwise, I really must insist that you leave before you waste any more of these students' very expensive time. I do have authorization. Her voice did not rise. But I would genuinely rather not turn your class into a scene over it. Why don't you continue teaching, and you and I can speak in the hallway afterward? That to Reeder sounded like defiance, like a woman who had been asked to leave and was refusing, and a man accustomed to unquestioned authority in his own room does not hear a reasonable request. he hears a challenge to the throne. "No," he said, and the patience curdled out of his voice and color came up in his face. "I am not going to continue while a stranger who will not identify herself sits in the back of my classroom. So here is your choice. Either you show me right now that you have any business being in this room, or I will call campus security and have them escort you from the building in front of everyone. It's entirely up to you." The hall had gone very quiet, and in the quiet, somewhere in the middle rows, a student lifted a phone above the seat backs and began, discreetly, to record, because 200 people could feel that something was going wrong, even if only one of them yet understood exactly how wrong and how expensively. "I'm going to ask you one final time," Reader said, and he reached for the phone on the lectern that connected to campus security, lifting the receiver with the theatrical deliberateness of a man certain the gesture itself would end the standoff. "Leave now, on your own, or I will have you removed, and I promise you that is not a scene you want 200 people to witness." It did not seem to occur to him that the 200 people were, at that very moment, witnessing a scene, just not the one he imagined. Camille did not move from the aisle. She did not raise her voice or reach for her bag, or do any of the small, anxious things a person does when they are afraid. She simply stood there, composed, and let him hold the receiver, and let the room watch him hold it, because she understood, as he did not, that every second he spent threatening her was a second the cameras were making permanent. "I'm waiting," Reader said into the silence, and the receiver was still in his hand, and he was incredibly still certain, because certainty like his does not dissolve in the face of a calm woman. It hardens. Every second you stand there refusing to identify yourself only makes my point for me. A student near the front, a young man who admired Reader, actually laughed. A small, nervous laugh meant to side with the professor, and it died in the air because no one joined it. Camille let the silence stretch. She had learned in 100 rooms that a man performing authority will always, if you simply wait, keep performing past the point where the audience turns. And she watched Reader do exactly that. Watched him mistake the room's dawning discomfort for suspense on his behalf. Watched him dig, with the receiver in his hand, a hole he could not yet see the bottom of. "I'm not refusing to identify myself," she said evenly. "I offer to do it privately so as not to humiliate you in front of your students. You would rather have it here. All right. But understand that this is your choice, Professor, and it is being recorded as your choice. Let me stop here and tell you what Alan Reader did not know, because it turns this from an ugly moment into something with real consequences behind it. The woman he was threatening to have dragged out by security was, at that moment, his boss's boss. Camille Foster was the dean of the entire faculty, the administrative head above every department chair in the school, including Reader's own. Her appointment had gone to his inbox 8 days earlier. Her photograph was on the university's own website, on a page anyone in that hall could have found in 15 seconds on the phones they were now, one by one, raising to film him. And this was the detail that would visit Reader in the small hours for months afterward. The program review that would shape his department's funding, its future hires, and the standing of its senior faculty would come down for final approval to exactly one signature, and it was hers. He was ordering the dean out of a classroom. He was threatening to have security remove the woman who held his department's future in her pen. Every proof was one tap away on 200 phones, and Reader was reaching instead for the campus security line. Now, here is the part worth sitting with, because Camille made a choice deliberately, in real time. She had the power to end the scene in a single sentence. "I am the dean of this faculty." 4 words, and she could have watched Alan Reader crumble in front of the students he was performing for. Part of her, the part that was 49 years tired of being asked to prove she belonged in rooms she had every right to sit in, wanted to. But she had learned something across 25 years that most people never get to learn, and it was this. Pulling rank teaches the readers of the world exactly nothing. If she flashed her title in the first 10 seconds and he folded, he would walk away believing his only mistake was failing to recognize a VIP, that the error was hers for not announcing herself rather than his, for deciding a black woman in the back row could not possibly belong. The instinct that had reached for the word security would go home intact and wake up just as sure the next morning, ready for the next student who did not fit his picture and could not summon a dean. So, she held the 4 words back. She wanted to see, and, more than that, she wanted the 200 young people in that room to see exactly how far a man like Alan Reeder would take it against a woman he was completely certain was no one, because that was the true measure of him. And it was, though none of them knew it yet, the single most important thing those students would learn all semester. If you have ever been told, in words or in a look, that you were in the wrong room, a room you had every right to be standing in, then you already feel the exact weight of this moment. So if it's landing, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps carry this story to the next person who's lived it. And stay with me, because someone is about to open the door at the back of that hall, and Alan Reeder's certainty is about to end for good. There was a student in the 3rd row who understood exactly what she was watching, and her name was Aaliyah. Aaliyah was 20, a sophomore, and she was black, and she had been in Alan Reeder's orbit for a semester, and she had learned the specific private sting of being in his classroom. He had a way of looking past her raised hand as though it were furniture, a way of receiving her comments with a thin, performed patience he never showed the students he had decided were serious. Early in the term, he had corrected her, publicly and wrongly, on a point she had had exactly right. And when she'd held her ground with the reference to prove it, he had made her feel, in front of everyone, that she had been presumptuous even to try. She had stopped raising her hand after that. She had told herself it was fine, that she was there for the degree and not the man, and she had felt herself, week by week, getting quieter in a room she was paying to sit in. Most of the students who looked like Aaliyah in that department eventually got quieter. It was not an accident. It was the room, doing what the room did, and Aaliyah could not afford to be one of the ones who got gone. She was there on a scholarship that required a grade point average, the first in her family to make it this far, carrying the quiet, crushing weight of being the proof her whole family had bet on. Making an enemy of a tenured professor in a small department was precisely the kind of risk a student in her position could not take, and she knew it. And Reeder, though he would never have put it in these words, counted on it. That was the machinery of his classroom. The students most likely to be treated as though they didn't belong were exactly the students least able to afford to object, and their silence looked, from the podium, like agreement. And the agreement looked like proof that the room was running the way it should, which is why what Aaliyah did next cost her more than anyone in that hall, except Camille, could fully understand. So when she watched Reeder round on the calm woman in the back and begin to do a louder, uglier version of the thing he had done to her all semester, Aaliyah felt it land in her own chest, the recognition, and under it the old, helpless anger she'd been swallowing since September. And she did the thing she had been too intimidated to do for 4 months. Her voice shaking, not quite believing she was doing it, she spoke up. She said she has permission. It came out thin and then steadied. Professor, she's not bothering anybody. She's just sitting there. Why can't she just watch the class? Stay out of this, miss. And Reeder stopped because he could not, in fact, produce her name. A semester in his seminar, and he had never once bothered to learn it, which told you everything. This does not concern you. But it did concern her, and it concerned every student in that hall who had ever been made to feel small in it. And the silence that followed Aaliyah's words was a different kind of silence than the one before. The sound of a room whose sympathy had just shifted, audibly and all at once, away from the man at the podium. A few more phones came up. Somewhere in the rows, another student murmured agreement. Reeder felt the mood of his own classroom turn against him for the first time in 30 years, and he mistook it, the way men like him always do, for a discipline problem, a room that needed to be brought back to order, rather than for what it actually was. 200 young people watching their professor reveal himself and deciding in real time what they thought of what they saw. The lecture hall door opened at the worst possible moment for Alan Reeder, and the best possible moment for everyone else. The man who came in was the university provost, the chief academic officer of the entire institution, senior even to the deans, and he had come, as it happened, for a small courtesy. To find Dean Foster on her classroom rounds and walk her to a lunch with the department chairs. He had expected to slip in quietly at the back and wait. Instead, he opened the door onto a lecture hall in dead silence, 200 students filming, and his own newly appointed dean standing in the aisle, while a red-faced professor threatened her with campus security. The provost took it in for 1 second, and then he said, into the silence, in a voice of complete and pleasant unconcern that detonated the room, "Dean Foster, I'm so sorry. Am I interrupting? Professor Reeder, I see you've met our new dean." Dean Foster. The 2 words rolled down over 200 students and 1 professor, and the hall made a sound, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of understanding, a few audible gasps from students who had just realized, all at once, exactly what they had been filming. Every phone in the room steadied. In the 3rd row, Aaliyah put her hand over her mouth, and Alan Reeder, 30 years behind that lectern, felt the floor of his certainty simply give way beneath him. "The dean," he managed. "The dean of your faculty," the provost said, crossing toward Camille with an expression of dawning, visible dismay. "Dr. Camille Foster, appointed last week. The announcement went to every professor in the school." He paused, and there was something almost pitying in it. "I believe it went to you, Alan. If you have ever waited for a semester, for a career, for a lifetime, for the moment the truth finally lands in a room that refused to see it, then take 1 second right now and leave a like, because it is exactly the thing that carries this story to the next person who has been the one nobody believed. And stay with me, because what Dean Foster did in the next 5 minutes is the part worth staying for. And it is not what most people, handed that much vindication, would have done." The color drained out of Alan Reeder's face and did not come back. You could watch the arithmetic happen behind his eyes, the unread email, the website he had never checked, the stranger he had been 30 seconds from having removed, all resolving at once into the single most important person in his professional life, sitting in his classroom, having watched him at his very worst. He gripped the edges of the podium, his mouth opened and closed. "Dean Foster," he said finally, and his voice had lost every ounce of its lectern authority. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea. You didn't identify yourself. You weren't. I told you I had permission to observe. Twice." Camille's voice was quiet, and it filled the enormous room far more completely than his shouting had. "I asked you twice to simply continue your lecture. I offered twice to sort it out privately in the hallway so as not to disrupt your students. You chose instead to threaten me with security." She closed her notebook, unhurried, and stood. "And I want to be very clear about something, Professor, because it matters more than my title, and I want your students to hear me say it. You did not do this because I failed to prove I was the dean. You did it because you looked at a black woman sitting quietly in the back of your classroom and decided, before I had said a single word, that she could not belong here. My title only means that you happened, this once, to be wrong about the one person who could hold you to account for it. Every other time you've made that decision, and I don't think this was the first, you were wrong about someone who couldn't." The provost started to speak, but Camille lifted a hand, gently, and did the thing that turned the whole morning into something better than a reckoning. She turned to the 200 students, her students, in the sense that all of them now were, and she did the last thing any of them expected. She taught. "Since I've disrupted your seminar," she said, stepping down toward the front of the hall, "let me at least make it worth the interruption. What you just watched is the most important thing you will study all semester, and it is not on the syllabus. She let the room settle around her voice. You watched how quickly a room decides who belongs in it. You watched a person in authority act on that decision with total confidence and precisely zero evidence. Some of you, and here her eyes moved, unhurried, across the rows, have been on the receiving end of exactly that, in exactly this room, and have been getting quieter all semester because of it. And then you watched one student have the courage to say, out loud, that it was wrong, before anyone in this hall knew who I was, when speaking up could only cost her and could not possibly help her. Her gaze found Aliyah in the third row and stayed there a moment. I want you to remember which of those things took character. It was not the title. It was not the man at the podium. It was the sophomore in the third row who said something when it was expensive to say it. Study that. It will serve you longer than anything in the reading. Then she turned back to Alan Reeder one last time, and what she said to him she said quietly, almost gently, which made it land harder than any rebuke. I'm not going to have you removed from this room, Professor. It's your classroom, at least for today, and these are your students and they came to learn something. So, finish your lecture. She let that sit. But I'll be auditing this seminar for the rest of the term, not you, the room, how it feels to be a student in it. I'd encourage you to teach the next hour as though the person in the back row you can't quite place might turn out to be someone who matters. And then I'd encourage you to ask yourself why you'd need to be told that. She gathered her notebook and she walked up the aisle she'd been ordered down, unhurried, and she took a seat again in the very back row, the seat he'd tried to throw her out of, and she opened her notebook and she waited, pen in hand, for him to resume. He did not manage much of a lecture, but the point had been made, and every student in that hall understood it, and several of them would say years later that it was the single most instructive hour of their entire education, and that not one word of it had been about the subject on the syllabus. The provost walked her to the lunch afterward, both of them quiet for the first half of the corridor. He was shaken. You could see him wanting to promise her that Reeder would be gone by Friday, that he would personally see to it, the reflexive overcorrection of a decent man who has just watched something ugly happen on his watch. Camille stopped him gently in the hall. Don't do it in anger, she said, and don't do it fast to make yourself feel better. Do it correctly. Open a real review. Look at the whole record. Give him the process you'd give anyone, and let the record decide. If it's as bad as I think it is, the record will say so. And then it's the institution acting on evidence, not a new dean settling a score on her first week. The provost looked at her, this woman who had been publicly humiliated in a lecture hall an hour earlier, and was now counseling patience toward the man who'd done it, and he said quietly that most people in her position would want blood. Most people in my position, Camille said, have spent their whole careers being told to calm down and trust the process. I'm not going to become dean and immediately prove that the process only works when you skip it. She started walking again. Build it so it works for real. That protects the next student far better than my temper ever could. It was, the provost thought, the most formidable thing he had ever watched a person do with a grievance. Refuse to waste it and spend it instead on making the thing that had failed her work for the people coming after. Alan Reeder did not keep his classroom the way he'd had it, and the way it happened was quiet, which is worse than loud. There was too much, and it was all documented, a dozen student videos from a dozen angles, 200 witnesses, and the provost standing in the doorway for the worst of it. But Camille handled it exactly as she had said she would, from the aisle, not as a personal vendetta, but as a matter of record. There was a formal review, and it did not confine itself to that single morning. It examined the pattern underneath, the students, semester after semester, who had quietly stopped raising their hands in Alan Reeder's seminar, and the ones who had transferred out of the concentration entirely, and why. The first-generation young man from 2 years earlier turned out not to be the only one. He was simply the one someone finally went looking for. The review itself was not a shouting match. It was quieter, and quieter was worse. Reeder sat across a table from a committee and a stack of student statements and the videos, and he began, as men like him do, by explaining the context, the pressures of a demanding seminar, the necessity of maintaining standards, the way a moment could look, out of context, worse than it was. And a member of the committee, an older woman who had known him for 20 years, let him finish, and then said only, "Alan, we have watched the video. We are not confused about the context. We are asking you to account for the pattern." And she slid across the table the thing that undid him. Not the video of the dean, but a thin sheaf of accounts from former students going back years, each one small and deniable on its own and damning all together, describing the same thing in the same room from a dozen different vantage points. He had thought the morning with the dean was his catastrophe. Sitting there, he understood that the morning with the dean was merely the day the pattern finally met someone it couldn't cost. Reader was required to step back from teaching while the review ran its course, and the imperious version of Alan Reader, who had run his lecture hall like a small kingdom for 30 years, did not come back to it. Whether he taught again at all came down, with a precision he would appreciate for the rest of his life, to a recommendation that carried the dean's signature, the same signature that governed the fate of his whole department, the one he had never imagined belonged to the woman he'd tried to have removed from the back of his room. And here is the uncomfortable part, because the story is a lie if I leave it out. Alan Reader got caught because he happened to aim his certainty at the one person on the entire campus who outranked him. Strip that accident away, and what's left is a professor who was, by the university's old conventional measures, a distinguished member of the faculty for 30 years, where being distinguished quietly included deciding, class after class, who was serious and who was presumptuous, whose hand was worth seeing and whose was furniture, and being rewarded with tenure and prestige for the whole apparatus. For every reader who orders the dean out of his classroom and ends his career on 200 phones, there are a great many more still standing at lecterns, running the smaller, safer version on 18-year-olds who cannot summon a provost, who simply get quieter and then get gone and are never counted. The cameras found this one. The only question the story really leaves you with is how many they never find, and how many brilliant students the world loses in rooms exactly like that one, for no reason anyone will ever write down. Now, let me tell you what happened to Aaliyah, because a professor stepping back from a lectern is not the same thing as justice, and the two need to be counted separately. Camille Foster does not forget the person who does the right thing when it is frightening and unrewarded, and a 20-year-old sophomore who spoke up before anyone knew a dean was in the room, when it could only cost her, was exactly that person. Camille made a point, in the weeks that followed, of learning the name Reader had never bothered to. She found Aaliyah after that class had cleared, still shaken, half afraid she had made trouble for herself by speaking. Camille didn't give her a speech. She just said, "You said it was wrong before you knew I was anyone. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people wait until it's safe. You didn't." Aaliyah started to say it wasn't a big deal, and Camille stopped her, gently, the way a woman who spent 25 years being underestimated learns to stop that sentence in someone else. "It was the whole thing," she said. "Everyone in that room found a reason to look away. You didn't. Don't ever let anyone teach you it was small." She became, informally and then formally, a mentor to the young woman who had spoken up, the kind of mentor Aaliyah had needed and, until that morning, never had. Aaliyah started raising her hand again. 2 years later, she would be applying to graduate programs with a letter of recommendation from the dean of the faculty, and, more valuable than the letter, the settled confidence that she belonged in the rooms she was walking into, a thing no one can hand you and that someone, once, has to make it safe enough for you to build. She got in everywhere she applied. Camille read the acceptance letters over the phone with her. Aaliyah couldn't quite make herself open them alone. And there was a particular one, from a program Aaliyah had been sure would never take her, that made them both go quiet on the line. Aaliyah went on to a doctorate. Years later, she would stand at the front of her own seminar room on the first day, and she would make a point of doing the opposite of what had been done to her, of finding the student hanging back at the edge, the one braced to be told they were in the wrong place, and letting them know, in some small, unmistakable way, that they were exactly where they belonged. She kept a note above her own desk, in her own handwriting, that said simply, "Be the person in the third row." She had been that person once, terrified, for about 10 seconds, and it had changed the direction of her life. She intended to spend her career passing the 10 seconds forward, and Camille kept doing the classroom visits. That was the part that mattered most. She did not decide, after reader, that the experiment had been a mistake or a risk. She decided it had proven its worth, that the habits of a faculty really are invisible from behind a desk, and that the only way to change who a room welcomes is to keep showing up, unannounced, in the back row, until welcoming everyone becomes the habit instead of the exception. She started small and concrete because she distrusted grand gestures. She had every department begin to actually track the thing Reader's classroom had made invisible, who spoke and who was called on, and who quietly disappeared from a concentration, and why. It was unglamorous work, and she preferred it that way, because she distrusted anything that felt like a gesture. She had departments start keeping the numbers that make invisible things visible, not to punish anyone, but because you cannot fix a pattern you refuse to measure. And the whole genius of the quiet kind of prejudice is that it never leaves a number if no one insists on counting. She built a way for students to report what had happened to Marcus and to Aaliyah without staking their scholarships on it. She put money and mentorship behind the students the old rooms had been quietly bleeding away. None of it made a headline. All of it changed, year over year, who stayed, which was the only measure Camille had ever actually cared about. Because a faculty does not reveal itself in who it admits with fanfare, but in who is still there, hand raised, in the third row, in the spring. And she told the story of that morning, carefully and without ever naming him, at a faculty gathering months later, not to shame anyone, but to make a single point, that the most dangerous prejudice in a university is never the loud, ugly kind that announces itself, but the quiet, confident, credentialed kind that mistakes itself for standards and looks at a person and decides before a word is spoken whether the room was built with them in mind. She told it, that story, at a faculty gathering some months later, a room full of professors, many of them tenured, some of them Reader's friends, a few of them quietly certain that the whole affair had been overblown. She did not name him. She did not need to. Everyone knew. She simply described, without heat, what it is to walk into a room you have every right to be in and be told, on sight, that you have wandered somewhere you don't belong. And then she asked them, plainly, to consider how many of their own students had felt some quieter version of that in their own classrooms, and had said nothing, and had gotten quieter, and had left. "I was able to answer it," she said, "only because I happened to outrank the man who did it to me. Your students cannot answer it. They can only absorb it or leave. I am not asking you to be afraid of your classrooms. I am asking you to be curious about them, about who stops talking and when and why." It was, several of them admitted afterward, the most uncomfortable 40 minutes they had spent in that faculty in years. It was also, a good number of them found, impossible to unhear the next time they stood at a lectern and a hand in the back did not go up. One of them, a senior professor who had privately thought the whole business overblown, that Reader had simply been careless and was being made an example of, went back to his own seminar that week and, almost against his will, started noticing. Noticing who he called on first. Noticing the two students in his own room whose hands he somehow never quite saw. Noticing that he had, without ever deciding to, built a small hierarchy of whose ideas he treated as serious, and that it had a shape to it he did not like looking at. He never told anyone. He simply, quietly, changed how he ran his room. And a year later, a student he'd nearly overlooked wrote him a note at graduation, thanking him for being the first professor who had made her feel she belonged in the field. He kept that note. He never connected it, out loud, to the uncomfortable 40 minutes in the faculty gathering. But he knew. Let me leave you with the thing underneath all of it. Alan Reeder looked at a woman and saw an intruder because she was black and unfamiliar and sitting in a room he had decided was his. And she turned out to be the dean of his entire faculty, with his department's future resting on her signature. That is the irony, and it is a clean one, and it is why the story travels. But the irony is not the point, and I don't want you to leave thinking it is. The point is the thing Camille told those 200 students quietly, in the middle of her own humiliation, that she was simply the one person in that hall who happened to be able to hold him to account, and that the real tragedy is all the others he did this to who could not, the students who stopped raising their hands, the ones who decided the room was not for them and quietly went away, and were never counted and never came back. A world where you have to be the dean to be allowed to sit in the back of a classroom has fixed nothing at all. It has only, once in a great while, by pure accident, aimed its assumptions at someone with the standing to answer them back. So, let me ask you what I always ask, because your answers are the best part of doing this. Have you ever been told, in words or in a look, that you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be? A classroom, an office, a room where you had earned your seat. And what did you make of how Camille handled it, turning her own humiliation into the lesson and giving the credit to the student who spoke up? Would you have had that composure? I'm honestly not sure I would. Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story moved you, do the small things that carry it to the next person. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not already here, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that belonging was never something you should have to prove at the door. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. Take care of each other. Be the person in the third row, and I'll see you in the next one.